The year is 1943, a year that would see the tides of war begin to shift, but not without immense sacrifice and struggle. The world was engulfed in a conflict that touched every corner of the globe, leaving no nation untouched. The world is at war. From the Pacific to Europe, from North Africa to the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, battles raged on land, sea, and air. The scale of destruction was unprecedented, and the stakes had never been higher. For almost 2 years, the Eastern Front has been a scene of unimaginable violence. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of lives were lost in a brutal struggle for survival. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of this devastation, fighting to repel the relentless German advance. On one side, the seemingly unstoppable German war machine, equipped with advanced weaponry and driven by a strategy of blitzkrieg that had overwhelmed much of Europe. On the other, the vastness of Russia, its harsh winters, and the unyielding will of the Soviet people. They fought not just for their land, but for their very existence, enduring hardships that tested the limits of human resilience. In this cauldron of conflict, a small, seemingly insignificant place on the map would rise to prominence. Kursk, a name that would soon become synonymous with carnage, resilience, and a turning point in the war. This was a battle the Germans could not afford to lose. It was a gamble, a high-stakes operation meant to regain the initiative. And yet, lose they did, marking a decisive shift in the balance of power. Why did Germany fail at Kursk? Was it a failure of strategy, or were they simply outmatched by the Soviet defenses? The answers are as complex as the battle itself. It's a question that still echoes through history, debated by historians and military strategists alike. Kursk was more than just a battle. It was a clash of ideologies, resources, and sheer willpower. Was it hubris, the arrogance of a military machine drunk on past victories? Did overconfidence blind the German leadership to the challenges they faced? Or was it the tenacity of the Red Army, fighting with their backs to the wall? Their determination to defend their homeland was matched only by their ingenuity in preparing for the German onslaught. Or was it a combination of factors, a perfect storm of miscalculations, missed opportunities, and the sheer unpredictability of war? The truth lies in the details, in the decisions made on both sides. To understand the Battle of Kursk, we need to step back and understand the context, the broader picture of the Eastern Front, and the events that led to this pivotal moment in history. The ebb and flow of the Eastern Front shaped the course of the war, and Kursk was its crescendo, a battle that would define the fate of nations and the future of the world. In 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million Axis troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler believed that a swift and decisive victory would crush the Soviet Union before it could mount a significant defense. It was a gamble on a scale never before seen in human history, a bold attempt to secure Germany's dominance in Europe and beyond. The initial German onslaught was devastating. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed, and cities fell one after another. The speed and ferocity of the attack left the Soviet forces reeling. The Wehrmacht, honed to a razor's edge by years of war, sliced through Soviet defenses, their blitzkrieg tactics seemingly unstoppable. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing vast swaths of land and resources. But the vastness of Russia, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the harshness of the Russian winter all conspired to slow and eventually halt the German advance. The Wehrmacht, unprepared for the brutal cold, struggled to maintain momentum as their supply lines stretched thin. The Germans, accustomed to quick victories, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition. The once dominant blitzkrieg tactics faltered in the face of determined Soviet resistance and logistical nightmares. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 was a shock. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched in freezing conditions, caught the Germans off guard and forced them into a desperate retreat. The Germans were pushed back, their aura of invincibility shattered. The Soviet victory at Moscow marked a turning point, proving that the Red Army could stand up to the Wehrmacht. The Eastern Front, once a symbol of German might, was becoming a meat grinder, consuming men and material at an alarming rate. The war in the East was no longer a swift campaign, but a brutal and grinding conflict. It was against this backdrop, in the summer of 1943, that the two armies would clash at Kursk. This battle would become one of the largest tank engagements in history. a decisive moment in the struggle for the Eastern Front. By 1943, the strategic situation was clear. The Germans, despite their setbacks, still held vast swaths of Soviet territory. A large salient, a bulge in the front line, had formed around the city of Kursk. This became the focus of German planning. Operation Citadel, as it was known, was to be a decisive offensive operation. Its goal was to pinch off the Kursk salient, encircle and destroy the Soviet forces within, and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The plan called for a classic pincer movement. Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group South would attack from the south, while General Model's Ninth Army would strike from the north. The objective was to meet at Kursk, trapping the Soviet forces. On paper, it looked like a sound plan. The Germans had concentrated a powerful force, including their formidable Panther and Tiger tanks. But on the ground, things were about to unravel. What the Germans didn't fully realize was that the Soviets were ready for them. Soviet intelligence, thanks in part to British code-breaking efforts, had learned of the German plans. They knew where and when the attack would come, and they had used the time wisely. The Kursk salient was transformed into a fortress, a layered defense in depth unlike anything the Germans had encountered before. Hundreds of thousands of mines were laid, creating dense minefields designed to slow and channel the German advance. Tank traps, ditches, and fortifications were constructed. Anti-tank guns were positioned in depth, ready to engage the German armor. The Soviets were determined to make the Germans pay dearly for every inch of ground. The stage was set for a titanic clash of arms. Section 5, David versus Goliath technological clash on the steppes. The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of armies, it was, well, a clash of technologies. The Germans had pinned their hopes on their new generation of tanks, the Panther and the Tiger. These were truly formidable machines, heavily armored and armed with powerful guns. But you see, the Soviets had a technological surprise of their own, the T-34 tank. The T-34 wasn't as heavily armed or armored as the German tanks, but it was fast, maneuverable, and its sloped armor gave it a surprising degree of protection. More importantly, it was available in large numbers. The Soviets had learned the hard way the importance of mass production in modern warfare. The T-34, for all its flaws, proved to be more than a match for the German panzers. Section 6. The bear holds firm. German miscalculations and Soviet resolve. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began. It was the largest tank battle in history, a clash of titanic proportions that would determine the fate of the Eastern Front. The German attack, preceded by a massive artillery bombardment, slammed into the Soviet defenses. The initial assault was meticulously planned, with the Germans hoping to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The fighting was fierce and unrelenting. Both sides suffered heavy losses as the battle raged on, with neither willing to yield an inch of ground. The German panzers, spearheaded by the Panthers and Tigers, made some initial gains. These formidable machines were designed to dominate the battlefield, but their effectiveness was limited by mechanical issues and the challenging terrain. But they were soon bogged down by the sheer depth of the Soviet defenses. The Soviets had prepared extensively, creating multiple defensive lines, each bristling with obstacles, trenches, and fortified positions. Minefields took a heavy toll, slowing the German advance and giving the Soviet anti-tank guns time to pick off their targets. The Germans found themselves in a deadly maze, where every step forward came at a tremendous cost. The Luftwaffe, the once vaunted German Air Force, enjoyed local air superiority but was unable to deliver a decisive blow. Despite their efforts, the Soviets had learned to adapt, dispersing their forces and fortifying key positions. The Soviets, too, had learned from their early defeats, and their air force, while still outnumbered, was far more experienced and better equipped than it had been in 1941. Soviet pilots, flying newer aircraft, were now able to challenge the Luftwaffe more effectively. As the days wore on, German casualties mounted. The relentless Soviet resistance, combined with the Germans' inability to achieve a breakthrough, began to sap their strength and morale. The attack, conceived as a quick, decisive blow, was turning into a war of attrition, the very thing the Germans had hoped to avoid. The Soviets, with their vast resources and unyielding resolve, were proving to be an immovable force, setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Section 7. Turning the tide. the Soviet counteroffensive. The Germans had miscalculated both in their assessment of Soviet capabilities and their own. They had underestimated the Red Army's willingness to fight. They had also overestimated their own strength. The German army of 1943 was not the same battle-hardened force that had swept all before it in 1941. Years of fighting had taken their toll. On July 12th, with the German offensive stalled, the Soviets launched their own counteroffensive. Fresh reserves, held back for this moment, were thrown into the fray. The Soviet counterattack, spearheaded by massed tank formations, caught the Germans off guard. The tide of the battle had turned. The Germans, their offensive power spent, were forced onto the defensive. Section 8. The Shadow of Kursk, a turning point in the east. The Battle of Kursk raged for another month before finally subsiding in late August 1943. It was a victory for the Soviets, a defensive victory to be sure, but a victory nonetheless. The Germans had suffered heavy losses, both in men and material. More importantly, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had passed decisively to the Red Army. From this point on, it would be the Germans on the back foot, retreating westward, harried every step of the way by the Red Army. Kursk was not the end of the war in the East, not by a long shot, but it marked a turning point, a shift in the balance of power that would eventually lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Section 9. Echoes of Kursk, Lessons in Warfare and the Human Cost. The Battle of Kursk offers many lessons for students of history and military strategy. It highlights the importance of intelligence and deception in warfare. It underscores the critical role of logistics and industrial capacity in modern conflict. And it serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war, the millions of lives extinguished on both sides. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Kursk is the importance of morale and determination. The Germans, despite their technological superiority, were ultimately defeated by a combination of factors: Soviet tenacity, their own miscalculations, and the sheer will of the Red Army to defend their homeland. Kursk, for all its horrors, stands as a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the face of unimaginable adversity.